Bona tarda, good afternoon. Gràcies per compartir amb nosaltres la presentació de l'exposició d'Iman Issa, Heritage Studies, que es fa amb l'ocasió del primer Premi Han Nefkens Macba d'Art Contemporani a Barcelona. Tinc a la meva esquerra a Iman Issa i també a Han Nefkens, amb els quals us proposarem de parlar sobre el treball, sobre l'exposició, sobre les motivacions i les implicacions d'aquests treballs i també, evidentment, per conversar amb vosaltres, els que tingueu preguntes o comentaris a fer amb l'artista Ombal Han. Jo volia agrair molt breument, abans de començar la conversa, sobretot l'impuls de patronatge de Han Nefkens a Barcelona. Han el coneixeu bé i sabem que té aquesta activitat de suport a artistes, escriptors, cineastes, gent del món de la moda una mica per tot en el món, però que m'interessa ressaltar que a Barcelona també ens beneficiem d'aquest impuls, no només a través d'aquest premi, sinó d'altres activitats que coneixem bé els que estem en el món de l'art. Gràcies també a la gent de l'equip de la Fundació Han Nefkens i en el Macba, l'Anna Sardà i l'equip de producció i muntatge dels equips que estan a l'entorn de totes les exposicions del museu. So, I'm going to sit and we have 2 microphones for 3 people, so we're going to be sharing... okay. This is for when, if someone comments or speaks in Catalan, you will hear the English translation. Teniu, els que no, per qui ho desitgi, hi ha una traducció simultània en el català amb cascos, qui ho necessiti. So, coming back to our theme, I thought that it would be good to hear from you about the motivations behind Heritage Studies, which is the title of the exhibition, the project that we present today, but it's also the title of a longer series of works that you have been doing, and I recall having seen in your last exhibitions at the Berlin Biennale and more recently also at the Perez Art Museum in Miami, which I didn't see, but I saw pictures of it. I mentioned the other day that I had the feeling that with the evolution of time, your work is becoming more and more minimal, whatever that means, but I saw it in relationship to simplification of forms and a search for geometrical elements within the material characteristics of the work, and as well as a very important play with space. The play between the object and the space that surrounds it, maybe in this occasion, is one of the elements that probably it's been in your work before, and we have other work of yours in the collection which we will show in June. So we have another occasion to contrast this exhibition with other work of you. But tell us from your point of view.
So thank you for the introduction and also for the question. This series started this year, 2015, and it is called Heritage Studies. And it came from a previous work that I'd done where I was I started to look to forms that belonged to the past, and I felt, and I was encountering these forms, and I felt that they had something relevant to say to the present. And this was kind of an interesting thing for me. Why would any artist look at forms that existed from the past, and what do you do when you encounter these forms and you feel they have something relevant to say? So this project was very much influenced by this question and this feeling, and basically what I started to do is I started to collect all of these forms that I encountered that I felt had something relevant to say to the present, and I started to think how best to communicate this relevance. And it was kind of interesting because I really realized that the only way to do this would be to make them again. And these were objects mostly encountered in museums, and a lot of them were really, really old. So, you know, they really belong to the very distant past, sometimes thousands of years apart from today. And basically I started to remake these forms, and what was interesting to me is none of the forms I made looked anything like the original forms. And it kind of brought me to this idea that perhaps you can present two forms or two objects that share neither the material, neither the color, neither the shape, neither the form, but still you can present them as being the same. And what does that mean? And for me it meant that they shared maybe a speech act, that they were saying something similar. As to the actual presentation in the space, I think it was also clear to me that the way these objects speak is not through only their form, but also through the place they're presented, through the language that is used to describe them, through the framework in which they're presented. So it was really important to present them in a space which is dedicated to the idea of looking and thinking, which is something you kind of expect when you enter an art museum. You expect to encounter something, and you are also enticed to think about it, or at least that's kind of an expectation. So in a way they also rely on that.
So what you're saying is that you like to challenge the public to start thinking about what they see.
I think of them very much as a form of communication. So I definitely imagine a viewer, and it's a way to posit a kind of proposal and to say, this is my idea about it, and I would love to have some kind of feedback. And in a way, this is why they are studies as opposed to conclusive forms. Because when you present something as a study, it's as if you're, I mean, for me, what I'm thinking is, this is my take on it, and even though it's presented in a very precious manner, and I personally am not going to alter it, I like the idea that, you know, it's presented in a way as like someone's idea that is also could change. So someone else could come and say, no, you're totally wrong. They shouldn't look like this. Mm-hmm. They should be bigger, smaller, a different color or material.
And you also feel that the work should be, in a way, talking to each other.
I think the work is not just the object. So the work is definitely the space, the lighting, the walls, the floor.
And the public.
And the public, yeah, definitely.
Now, changing a little bit the subject, of course, I'm very curious to know how you experienced this whole process of first winning the prize, well, first knowing that you were nominated, hearing that you win the prize, and then we talked about a proposal, and then the whole creative process started and went its own way. How did you experience that?
I mean, it was great. It was great to come here and to have to think, and to actually try to think of a project which is specific to here. I mean, this is how my thinking started. And the way I work, it takes, you know, things, I'm quite slow. So it takes me a really long time. I come up with an idea, and then, you know, it usually takes some testing. But one of the things I was really inspired by most here was museum displays. I mean, that was, and I mentioned this in the morning, but I went to the National Museum of Catalan Art, and I was really interested in that museum because I encountered a lot of objects there which I thought were really interesting, the way they are presented and the way they are speaking, but at the same time they were presented within a very, very strong framework, and that was really interesting to me. And even though this project is a larger project that I don't think is specific to a certain place, it kind of came out of this prize and thinking about something to do for here. And I think with the conversations I had with Bartomeu and Anna and others, it became very clear that if I was going to present the project outside, it would recreate the conditions of a museum. So then it made the most sense to also present it in.
So in other words, Barcelona, the city of Barcelona and its museums, inspired your work.
Absolutely, yeah.
But I think that's very nice for us to hear.
Yeah.
If I may, I wanted to ask you also about the relationship of different works of you with the idea of monument and commemoration and what should be remembered, what usually is or might be remembered. There is in your former work as well as with this one, I think, an important link to that, especially with the way you use the captions or the small texts that are supposed to describe the object in question. We normally, instead of describing, they open up potential identities.
Yeah, I became interested in monuments this was around 2009 or 2010, and it was really when I was thinking a lot about, I was working a lot with memory, and it was because I always think of the work as attempting to communicate with the viewer, so this became kind of a big question for me is, if you use memory in your work as a kind of basis to create forms, how can you guarantee communication when you use something as subjective and inaccessible as your own memory? And I became really interested in monuments and memorials because you had this kind of really interesting combination where you had a person or a group of people taking it upon themselves to offer a subjective vision, but at the same time with the idea that it would be held accountable to a collective, so that someone could be like, could question that form, that it was something to answer to. I also became really interested in the language of monuments and memorials, which if I was to generalize, I would say it is mostly symbolic and it's quite abstract. So these are two tendencies that I started to think of them as quite constructive means with which to communicate. And these were both also qualities that I was very suspicious of. So I used to actually think that the language of monuments and memorials is quite simplistic, it doesn't work. I used to somewhat discard it, and then around 2010 I really questioned that.
Actually, we were talking about this earlier this morning. I said that language is both limited and limiting, and then you said, well, it's all we have. So that's what we have to deal with.
No, it's true, I think, and it's also the realization or the feeling that what you say or how you describe something can also be what makes it happen, so that it can have even a more active role. I actually read a book by a scholar recently in the last 2 years, and she was speaking about certain traditions of antiquity in which the artifacts or the art, what we call artworks that were created, were not meant as representations of things that happened, but were actually projections of desired effects for the future. And then the first thing an intruding army would do when they enter a city is destroy these artifacts to prevent them from becoming true, which is really exciting for an artist, but it's also terrifying because, if this is really true, then you really better know the meaning of what you're making.
And you do. So, going back a little bit to language, of course in Egypt there used to be the hieroglyphs, the symbols that had a meaning rather than our lineal script. And I think that says a lot about the way people, and of course in Asia it's the same, the way people think, in concepts, rather than in the meaning that's derived from the order of the words.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting for me to look at these, to look at traditions from the past, to look at forms from the past, because part of me really believes that when the past is truly dead, it becomes irrelevant, and the fact that you would feel the need to look back at something means that it's doing something in the present, and this was, how this whole project started. Because with these forms, I actually never felt any debt to the past. I never felt a reason to look to it before, and all of a sudden, in the last few years, I feel more and more that it's not the past, it's the present.
Yes, but you also feel that your works should have relevance in the present?
I like to think of it as having a function. So I'm interested in the idea of a functional artwork as opposed to, and this is why heritage studies as a term was interesting to me, because in a way when you say your work is about history, there's the idea that this is an evidently constructive thing, that history, you know, looking back is evidently constructive, whereas heritage studies usually is presented as a field as having a practical end to the present. So usually there is something you're trying to do, whether preservation, whether changing laws, whether, you know, asserting that a culture had a history or existed to get a demand for the present.
Yeah, where history informs the present rather than looking back at it as something that's closed and far away.
Yeah, with this project it was really trying to understand what it could do. And of course it's not something I could explain, it's in words, but I think these were attempts to try and do that through making these forms.
I wanted to ask, how do you feel or could relate these works with the increasing paranoias that the contemporary world has with images, with signs, with symbols, with beliefs? I think we're facing today, especially in the last very recent period, the destruction of an incredible amount of historical heritage in the Middle East because of religious conceptions, and that also our relationship to these cultures which are at the origin of our civilizations is about to lose the material link we have with them. I mean, this is not a real question because it's nothing related to directly to your work, but I think it's parallel to, it's something that is happening unfortunately as we speak. Does it have some kind of effect or relationship with your motivations?
I don't necessarily, I mean, it's not something I've consciously reacted to, but I think just in terms of what you were saying about images and icons and forms, I think when you approach forms in an instrumental way, even though a word and an image are different, are structurally different, they become kind of the same because you're using them to communicate something. So whether you use a picture or a word, for me, they become on the same level, even though I understand they have different capacities, I treat them the same way. And you had, actually this kind of goes back to your question from before about the forms, because you said it's minimal, and for me it's interesting because it is true that if you start from a very busy picture and you end up with a simple form, then you are subtracting. But for me, it's usually what happens is I start from a blank slate, from zero. So I have no images, no forms, I feel completely depleted, and so when I make things, I feel like it's a process of addition and not subtraction.
Do you feel, excuse me, do you feel after you've finished these works that it is finished for you, or does it continue in your mind? Do you continue thinking about it?
Yeah, I think the projects, I mean, I think part of the reason I work in series is because sometimes it takes a lot to ask a question or to find a way out. And I think for these projects, I usually work on them until I reach a point where I feel I hit a point where I can't move any further in a constructive manner. To be completely honest, I have no interest in making things unless I find it absolutely necessary. So if there is no reason to make something, I won't make it. And I try to make things in the most compact manner possible. So to use only what I absolutely need.
When you say when it's only necessary, do you mean when there's an award and you have to make a work?
I mean, that's a good question, but I think when there is a question or there's something you need to figure out, and this is the way to figure it out. So with these series, the way they end is when I feel like I either figured the question I started without, or I reached a point where I know the system I devised for myself is not working anymore and I need to do something else.
So it's a process in which you yourself are exploring, as it were. It's not like you think, okay, now I'm going to make a work that's a staircase, but it's very small. You start thinking and then you start exploring how you feel about it.
Yeah, I think for these works, they were very much informed by the system. So usually I come up with a system that I feel like I need to work with in order to figure something out. Yeah, so in a way it's also hard for me to think of works, even though I know each work leads to another, but it's also they all become equal because they all, I never think of a work as a development of another work. It's more like it opens the door and I need to do something through it, but I wouldn't have been able to, so.
So that's why you work in series, because then one leads to the other, literally.
Yeah, I think so.
What is going to be your next lines of works? If you can tell us something about that.
So I'm actually continuing with this project, Heritage Studies. I want to, there are many forms I want to continue thinking about. And then I'm working on a project which I also started a few years ago called Lexicon, which is looking to artworks for definition of terms and the relationship between artworks to their titles and how an artwork could explain its title or become a means to understand language. Yeah.
Maybe we should open the questions from the audience if someone would like to add, comment or ask. It's not that we don't have anything else to say, but whenever you feel convenient and you want to intervene, please raise your hand and a microphone will be brought to you. No microphone, no question, no translation. So there is a question there. Is the microphone coming to you or do we have to... Yeah, the microphone is coming from your back.
So I wanted to speak a little bit about what you said about the role of the works having a function. Because it's very interesting that some of the forms that they already refer to are functional objects. So how do you see it? Like, first of all, I wanted to ask you, what do you mean by function? What kind of function do you see these forms having today? And there's the second level of translation, like how do you relate something? Because some of them, like the hexagon in a circle has no function, or maybe, I don't know what it really is, but yeah.
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting question, because when this project started, it started from another work where I was also looking to objects from the past, and I was using them as images. And it was interesting to me because I knew they kind of communicated something I was interested in, but I didn't know how they communicated. Like, for example, when you see a 1970s pendulum clock, you can, look at it and you can think, okay, this reminds me of my childhood because I used to have a clock like this at home. Or you can look at it and see that it's a functional object, so it tells time and this is how you think of it. Or you can not even see that and just see a shape and the form. And for me, these are all, I don't think of them as necessarily just subjective readings, but also maybe different phases in the life of an object. And I was really interested in not just objects, but like objects which were, or at least the ones that captured my attention were objects which were in museums as artifacts. So they'd already been declared as having an existence beyond their just function as a cup or a vase or an astrolabe. For me, the actual descriptions of the objects, so whether the hexagon has a function, which is to kind of recall the gods or whatever or not. I think for me, the actual description became another way to have the object speak. And when I think of them as functional, I was more thinking of them as having a relevance to the present. So it's not just about reinterpreting forms, but reinterpreting forms that you feel could actually tell you something useful, even though you don't really know what it is they're saying, or you can't really.
Si hi ha alguna pregunta també en català, no us sí, cap problema perquè traducció l'ella la seguirà, li ajudarem.
English is fine. I was wondering if you could discuss a little bit about the audio piece that was in the beginning of the exhibition, and if you see there's any relationship to the works that you've done, the sculpture works, if any.
Yeah, no, I think there's definitely a relationship. It's not an easy relationship, but it really has to do with this idea of the use of artworks, because the way this audio piece came about is I was working a lot with language, and it became clear to me that I had the same relationship to words as I did to forms, and that I feel I could use some words, some other words I couldn't use, and it was interesting to me to think why. But also feeling like as I was working with language, I was coming across terms and words I had no idea what they referenced. I just, when I think of the word, I just feel like I'm completely faced with a blank slate, like a monochrome black or white screen. And one of these terms was the revolutionary. And so I thought, why don't I try to write a story in order to perhaps understand what this term could signify or refer to. So this is what I did with this work, is I wrote this narrative and I turned it into an audio piece which is generated using text-to-speech, but it was really in an effort to try to understand the meaning of the term. And as I was finished it, then I became interested in the idea that perhaps artworks is the best place where you can do that. They're the best place where you can, or they're one very good place, maybe not the best place, but one very good place that I thought of, that I felt I could investigate the meaning of a term. And this, in a way, leads me to these works there.
I have a question for you. How would you like somebody who comes into the Macba and comes to your exposition, how would you like this person to experience it? How would you like the person to look at it?
I think if they can, okay, so the ideal imagined viewer, I have no idea what they look like, where they're from, whatever, but what I would really be so happy to kind of imagine is someone who, would look at the work, think about it, and really try to see only what is there, and not all the other stuff. Or at least that what is there would kind of entice you to look at it in a way where you actually see what is there.
So in other words, with an open heart?
That's a good way.
¿Alguna otra pregunta? I don't know if we have. I don't know if we have used the notion of archaeology to look or to approach your work, and since we spoke about the relationship to the past, archaeology is a great producer of things that come from the past and speak to us today. Was that something in your let's say, background or interests while addressing these issues?
Yeah, I don't really know much about archaeology. I know there are so many different schools and so many different ways to look at things, but it wasn't really something I looked at. And it was really coming from a very organic and intuitive feeling of just encountering things that felt relevant. It didn't come from studying or really intentionally seeking out the past, but actually encountering things that felt relevant.
Is there a last or a new question from the audience? It's, yeah, over there.
When I think about heritage, I immediately think about UNESCO. I mean, all the heritage sites you see all over the world. I mean, how far do you have to go back to talk about heritage? For you, in your work.
You mean how far in time?
In time or in mind or whatever? What is heritage for you?
Yeah, I mean, I think, well, I'm not sure it's just heritage. I was more interested in heritage studies, but it's exactly like this, you know, like an organization like UNESCO, usually when they look to the past, there's something they're doing, whether enacting laws, whether protecting civilizations. So it's this idea that, I like this idea that you're approaching the past with a function. So I was really relying on the field. The heritage studies as a field. It's not really an interest in heritage per se, like it's not about where I'm from, you know, it's not limited to a geographical location, it's not limited to a time period. It's really just an interest in this particular way of looking to the past.
Now, if there isn't a last question, I would like to, yeah, you have a, no? I would probably like to wrap up a little bit this event. Thank you, Iman, for your generosity, your involvement, your patience. It's been also a long process of bringing this show together from the very beginning since we started working, and many things happened in between, but we're very happy that it's a reality. Thank you, Han, for your ongoing support to the arts and complicity with Macba. And thank you all for, bueno, gràcies a tots per la vostra presència. Únicament recordar que el 16 i 17 de juny presentarem les adquisicions recents de les col·leccions del Macba i que hi podrem trobar també dues obres anteriors d'Iman Issa que probablement ens complementin també el coneixement que tenim del seu treball i que esperem que esperem que no és evidentment l'última vegada que la tenim entre nosaltres i que puguem retrobar-la encara moltes més ocasions. Moltes gràcies per la vostra assistència i podem continuar d'una manera més informal, si voleu, en aquest espai del Macba que colonitzem ara sovint per fer aquestes trobades. Moltes gràcies.